How's it going, everyone, and welcome into the second Friday episode here on the SFS channel for Week 7 fantasy football action. In this video, I'll be talking about 5 must-sell running backs as we approach this Sunday afternoon's games, and potentially, if you can't get a deal done before that point in time, at the top of Week 8. But ideally, with these being must-sell players, they are guys I don't like long-term, projecting their numbers out the rest of this season, looking towards how I value them the rest of this year. I'm looking to move on to bigger and better things and find better options for my fantasy lineup. So we've also got our must-sell wide receivers, 5 of those names as well out today. Go check out this video after you finish watching this one. Well, let's not waste any time. Let's hit the intro and get straight in to our first must-sell running back here in Week 7. All right, the first running back I'm going to talk about in today's episode is Damien Harris for the New England Patriots, their lead running back, of course. And earlier on this season, I think that there's actually significant value that was had here from Damien Harris being somewhat of a steady lineup play and just a dependable face to have in lineups as we got the year kicked off. But as we're making the push for the fantasy playoffs, obviously trying to improve the upside on our rosters, Damien Harris is not the move to make there. So what Damien Harris does present to us is somewhat of a quality floor on a week-to-week basis as a lower-end RB2, but what he can't do is come out here and win individual fantasy performances for you in matchups because his upside doesn't really scale that large in comparison to even some other more inconsistent names that just have the overall upside to produce more point output than he does. He's only got 8 receptions on this year, so he's not a pass-catching back. We know that, though. He hasn't been even dating back to his rookie year. It's clear that his job is to go run the football effectively and pack up yardage in the rushing department. And really, your upside you're looking at here is how many touchdowns he can get, because without him catching passes, you're looking at 10 points flat in PPR leagues from 100 yards rushing, and then 6 for every touchdown he scores thereafter. So really, his potential point outputs are 16 or 22, even if he has 100 yards and 2 touchdowns. But that's not something that happens on a frequent basis for him. He doesn't have any games over 16.5 fantasy points this year because, again, his ceiling to this point has been 100 rushing yards and a touchdown. So you're not really looking at a player who's going to give you better numbers than those. And he's only had 10-plus points in 3 games so far this fantasy season. So you're not looking at someone who's even overly that consistent as it is. He still has value, though. He can be used in the trade market to make a move. Basically, what I'm looking to acquire from these players is to go out and find an improvement either in the RB2 department, because I've only got one name who can really be classified as an RB1 on today's list. But you're going to want to be using these names. Maybe you even have to pair them with a wide receiver or some bench depth to go out here and make a significant improvement, most likely at the running back position for one of these names and assets. So again, Damien Harris is like Nick Chubb, except no explosive rushes of 20 or more yards, or at least a lot fewer, and no pass-catching volume. That's where I get the Nick Chubb part from, because he's almost a predominantly sole rushing threat who you're hoping can add on top of that some explosive plays, a high touchdown ceiling. That's stuff that Nick Chubb has that sets him apart and makes him an anomaly at the running back position for someone who doesn't catch passes. Damien Harris is someone who has a lot lower tendency to make those big explosive carries, and he's someone who also doesn't catch those balls. So the ceiling is very limited here, but again, that floor can be serviceable in some situations, but upside's what's going to win you these fantasy leagues, so you're not going to want to stick with someone who is solely a floor play at this point. Antonio Gibson. Now, this has more to do with salvaging the value he still has right now before the shin injury, the calf, all that stuff going on in the lower body for him gets worse and potentially causes him to miss some time this year, or even significant amounts of time, and therefore really doing a number on your fantasy lineups. You should prioritize getting a quality player in your lineups for Gibson right now rather than waiting, because with the stress fracture in your shin, that just seems like there's too many things that can go wrong. If he continues to put strain and stress on that injury, my only thought is that this thing could get worse. And the fact that he ended up straining a calf, and that wasn't the reason he left last week's game, being that shin injury, it was a calf, a separate issue. There's just a couple of risk factors that are making me feel really uneasy about this situation, given the fact that Antonio Gibson's receiving numbers are also much, much lower than what we expected them to be at this point. I mean, he's got 3 games with fewer than 10 fantasy points this year. That's not ideal. That's not what we're looking for. He's got 12 receptions total on the season, so you're talking about 2 catches per game through the first 6 weeks of the season here. That's not ideal. You're looking at a player who has very dynamic traits and abilities but isn't being used in that fashion. We can maybe point to a J.D. McKissick or some other names in this offense that are eating up some of that play. Otherwise, the only real thing to blame here is play calling, the coaching staff, and just the quarterback's decision-making, not passing him the football. But obviously we expected to see more designed playmaking opportunities for Gibson in the passing game this year. That just hasn't been the case. So you've got the risk with the injuries, you've got the lack of productivity in the passing game, and you've got the fact that he's put up multiple bust-worthy performances this season so far with those 3 games under 10 fantasy points and half PPR scoring. You're looking at a player who carries a significant amount of risk, a reduced amount of upside, and overall I think is just a shaky situation to be in. So if I can sell Gibson and a depth wide receiver piece to go out and get a DeAndre Swift even, that's something I'm doing. I'm looking at fringe running back ones right now. If you can flip Gibson for a James Robinson, I might even prefer that as well, because this shin injury is starting to really glare over his season-long ranking for me, which will be impacted and reflected in next week's rest of season running back rankings episode. And I just see the upside is trending downwards right now for Gibby as well, which is really making me fade off of him here and want to move on. Myles Gaskin, this is a little bit of a unique situation. So he goes from having his best fantasy performance of the season to absolutely bottoming out here and having a terrible performance. So this one might be tough to find a trade scenario for. But Myles Gaskin's a player I haven't trusted all season long. I haven't been a big fan of. And going forward, if I can move off of him, I'm getting him off my team every chance I get. Obviously, if you get a respectable offer in return for him. But man, I mean, he hasn't been consistent this year. This Dolphins offense, outside of Jalen Waddle and Mike Gesicki, has been a mess. And there's just too much going against him right now. Any red zone value that Myles Gaskin had heading into the season, Malcolm Brown basically asserted himself, took that value away. And it's not like Malcolm Brown has snatched all that many scores this year, because the Dolphins just are not scoring. And this offense has been inefficient, dealing with quarterback injuries and all that stuff, which has lowered the overall productivity of this team as a whole. Gaskin comes out here, has a great week against the Buccaneers, catches a ton of passes. He had double-digit receptions in that game, finds the end zone twice, and it's looking like he's going to be trending up. It's all fine and dandy, but then he goes right back down to, 1 fantasy point the following week. So a lot of inconsistencies for Myles Gaskin. 5 games under 10 points, that 126-pointer being the outlier in this offense. Not a situation I like at all. All Miami Dolphins running backs are pretty much super low upside for the rest of the season. Even Malcolm Brown having that touchdown role potentially on this team, it's not like you're going to see him. Whereas with the Rams, they were at least moving the football and getting in scoring territory. The Dolphins just aren't putting themselves in situations where those touches are even meaningful, because they're not getting enough of them. So without the touchdowns, unless Myles Gaskin can find a way to become a very heavily involved factor in the receiving game, I don't see much upside or even floor value for that matter with Gaskin. So hopefully you sold him last week after that huge game against Tampa. But if not, I'm still trying to cling to that and use that performance as ammo and trade bait to get him off of my team, because long term, there's not too much lineup value he'll be providing for you. Mike Davis, the thing with Mike is he at least has a respectable fantasy floor. It's not great, but it's something. But he's almost got no ceiling to be spoke of here this season. With the amount of touches and volume he's getting for this Falcons offense, you would think his numbers would be better than where they're at right now. But it really comes down to offensive line play, offensive production from this team and group as a whole, and how they're moving the football, and just talent. Mike Davis is not some phenomenal running back. He's not a dynamic playmaker, a super awesome player who, despite being a quality fill-in for McCaffrey last season, just doesn't really have the explosive intangibles and the capability of going out here and having boom performances. Again, it goes back to the talent. He's a low upside player. He's bounced around the league. He's been at the handful of teams, the Seahawks. I believe he had a stint with Chicago and the Bears, Carolina, and then now in Atlanta. So what? He's been around to 4 teams now. He's a decent player. We'll give him that. I mean, in every fantasy game this year, he's ranged between 7.5 and 10 fantasy points. But his yardage totals are very disappointing. He's not very efficient. He's like a poor man's, I wanted to say a poor man's Josh Jacobs, but their play styles are even still not very comparable, and Josh Jacobs is a much better talent than Mike Davis. I'll give him that. But in terms of their fantasy scoring, maybe that's something that can be found there. But besides that fact, Mike Davis is just overall a very low ceiling fantasy running back to have right now. Cordero Patterson is far and away the running back or wide receiver hybrid, depending on what app league you're playing in. You can play him all over the board. Flex, running back, wide receiver. He's awesome. He's very dynamic. He's the one catching passes, being sprinkled in the run game. That's the guy you want for this Atlanta backfield, if that's what you want to call it. Mike Davis's ceiling is almost unheard of this year. And again, all of his games are between 7.5 and 10 fantasy points. So that's serviceable in a week where we've got terrible bye weeks just killing the running back market for available players and lineups this week. There's something to be had here, and maybe you can find a deal for a very desperate team that might even need someone to play RB2 for the lineups with all the teams and players we've got out with buys. So try and take advantage of that. Mike Davis is a name that you can look to flip for something respectable. He's probably going to have to be used with another helping piece here, because I don't think Mike Davis on his own gets a quality deal done for your team. But you can use him again in a wide receiver 2 or 3 piece and try and make an upgrade at that running back position, potentially flipping him for someone who is on a bye week with one of those desperate teams that's needy of a player to fill in for this week. And then Chuba Hubbard. This goes back to it's bye week hell right now. There are so many teams and valuable fantasy players not suiting up this week because they're on vacation. They're on their rest week. They're healing up. Delvin Cook's my favorite player that's on bye right now because I think he needs that time to get his ankle a little bit better, and I'm actually very happy that the Vikings have this week 6 bye right now, week 7 bye, so that he can come out here and hopefully be back to himself and even more able to produce up to his standard in week 8. But Chuba Hubbard, I mean, this is a short-term fantasy asset. If we're being honest with ourselves here, you have to expect and act like Christian McCaffrey is going to come back at full strength and at full capability of putting up lineup numbers. McCaffrey's injury history the last 2 years has been a very rocky road. It's been very shaky, unreliable. It's been really frustrating to deal with. But again, you have to anticipate that after he comes off the IR and is on there for those 3 weeks that he's got to be down there, he should come back at full strength and be the Christian McCaffrey that we've seen in previous seasons. Chuba Hubbard, with that being said, becomes a expiring asset who has a ticking time clock on how long he's actually going to be a starting level player. Same thing, same case as Mike Davis here. Now, Chuba, I would say, is a better talent than Mike Davis, but that all to the side now. Chuba Hubbard is someone that in this terrible week of buys, where you've got so many desperate teams really needy for a player to fill in at that position, you can use him as an asset to get you a long-term player who can actually help your team down the stretch of this season. Now, it's not going to be some unworldly player that you're going to get in return. You're not going out here and trading even Chuba for a high-end RB2. But if you can flip him for someone who had a down week last week, someone who, again, just going back to that desperate and needy fantasy team and lineup out there, there's some value to be had here. Chuba Hubbard, if you're especially not a Christian McCaffrey owner, now maybe you think twice about this if you do have CMC on your team, because obviously then Chuba becomes more valuable to you long-term this season because of the fact that we have some uncertainties with McCaffrey's injury. But again, if you're not a McCaffrey owner and you've got Chuba on your roster, you got lucky with your waiver wire pickup. If the CMC owner just decided not to draft Hubbard, you can sell him here. Find yourself a player who the entirety of the rest of the way of the season will give you lineup potential and productivity. That's the way you want to go about this. Take advantage of the short-term hype isn't the right word, but the short-term value and production that Chuba is having, because right now while he's in the lineup, he's putting up quality serviceable numbers, and use those to find yourself something that'll work better long-term. Alrighty, those are 5 running backs I am looking to sell here ahead of Week 7 fantasy football action. Go check out some of the other fantasy episodes we posted this week in addition to today's other video, which is the wide receivers episode of this must-sell segment. And I'll see you guys there. Peace out.